welcome to Dermveda's beauty blog, Skinterview. I'm your host, Vanita Sivamani, and I'm here today with President and CEO of National Hair Loss, Klein. Thanks so much for being with us today, Carly.
Hi, thanks for having me.
So we are delighted to have you, and we'd love for you to start by sharing your background. If you can tell us how you formed your passion to really help with women and those with hair loss.
Yeah, absolutely. So I started my journey working with women with hair loss about 12 years ago. And what happened was I was working for a dermatology office where we really noticed that it was more geared towards men. We were seeing a few women a year, and all we could do was give them Rogaine. And so I made it my venture to really see what we can do to help not only women and men, but what we could do to actually stabilize the hair loss. And so that's when I started my company, National Hair Loss, to find out the latest techniques on stopping and how do we reverse some of that hair loss that we see today.
Terrific. So how do you actually identify the first stages of hair loss?
Well, the first stages, a lot of times what we find is by the time that you've noticed that you've ever had hair loss and you see something's changed, they say 50% is already thinned out in that area. So that's why it's so crucial not to just worry about how do we get it back, but how do we stabilize the disease. So one of the things that we'll find is the pattern. So once you start to see a thinning on the top, that's usually indicative of having some type of genetic hair loss. Or if you see an uptick in shedding, that's usually more of a hormonal imbalance. So we'll get somebody to a specialist if we're seeing that too.
So what are some of the misconceptions that you hear a lot about hair loss?
That shedding, they worry that that's permanent. Women especially, they panic when they start to see that. And I always liken it to losing your baby teeth. You never panic when you lose your baby teeth. So you should never panic when you're shedding. If you're not shedding, your hair's not growing. So in fact, every time you go like this and you see a hair, it actually disconnected from the root 3 months ago. It's just working its way out. The problem is if you're having more of a permanent hair loss, each individual hair is getting finer and finer. So we try to figure out how do we actually create a thicker hair follicle. But that's one of the misconceptions. Another thing is wearing a ponytail or wearing a hat too tight. None of those things cause hair loss. The only time that we do see women who are having hair loss are men, or if you're having wigs or hair systems or extensions. Over years, you can pull out the roots. So those are some of the things that people think. Also, washing your hair less. You should never wash your hair less if you're having alopecia. Getting the scalp cleansed every day to every other day is primary.
Good to know. So how do women and men experience hair loss differently?
Very much. And I think the difference is women come to me typically and they think, well, I have a hormonal issue or I have thyroid, because they think that they should look like a man if they're having genetic hair loss. Men go bald, whereas women go diffuse. So men start to see their hairline scrunch up and then they start to get the bald spot. Women don't typically go bald, they go diffuse. So they always start to see thinning in the temporal region. They'll keep their hairline, but then right here is where they'll see their part get bigger and bigger. And so that's usually the difference between them. Where you always have good hair is straight in the back. So if you were dealing with any other type of hair loss, you would be losing it back here too. So I always tell men and women, feel the hair back here. And if you feel that the hair is finer up here versus here, then we know you've got genetic alopecia.
So what are some things people can do to prepare to actually speak with their physician about their hair loss?
So one of the things that we ask is just have a full medical history. What medications that you're on, what have you done so far, what are you currently using? And then some photos, because then we can truly see what type of alopecia you're experiencing. 90% of the women that we see all have genetic hair loss. 10% are dealing with some other type of hair loss, meaning alopecia areata, post-pregnancy, things like that we can deal with. And that's what we would need first before we can kind of send them through.
Great. And my last question for you is, what advice do you have for people coping with hair loss?
I always tell people the biggest thing is knowledge empowers people. So if you can actually learn why it's happening, it's not so scary, because there are ways that we can completely stop the hair loss now. And so I think it's buying all of these products and not knowing what works is what's so hard. And then working with people who have a support group. We have a support group that's a private page that's for patients, so that they can talk to one another. So we've got girls that are as young as 20 on there, all the way up to your 60s and 70s. And that way it's this team effort. What's worked for you might work for another patient. So share your experiences. Especially with women, we see that we feel like nobody else has hair loss and we kind of feel alone. And so working with a group of women that are experiencing the same thing can be cathartic.
Well, great. Thank you, Carly. We know how difficult this is for people, those with hair loss, to actually cope and manage that. So thank you for all the work you're doing and the support you provide. And to our readers and our listeners, please submit your questions below if you have any, and be sure to tune in again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.